Right, well, the Morrison government's federal budget has been quite well received by voters. Popular support for the coalition is at its equal highest since last year's election. In the latest news poll for the Australian newspaper out today, the coalition's primary vote is up 1 point, Labor remaining steady, and the Greens have dipped 1 point. On the two-party preferred 2PP basis, well, the government's lifted its lead by 1 point, taking it to 52-48. And Scott Morrison has maintained his high approval ratings, leading Anthony Albanese in the Better Prime Minister poll 57-28. Joining me now for his analysis, the Australian's political editor, Dennis Shanahan, from the beautiful south coast of New South Wales. All right, Dennis, I'll go to that. I mean, we've been caught up in a whole manner of other things today, but I think it's important not to lose sight of this really significant budget that came down last week, and obviously these news poll results today. What do you make of the results? But, you know, we haven't spoken for a week since the budget. How do you think it's gone down with all the various stakeholders?
Well, I think overall the budget's gone down very well. That's clear. That's gone over well with the public from the news poll survey today. And why wouldn't it? The government spent a fortune in the lead up to the budget. They spent $507 billion. So that was a big spend. And the only real problem from the electorate, apart from some complaints that had ignored women, was the question of whether the subsidy for hiring, the hiring credit, should have gone beyond 35 years. At the moment it goes between 16 and 35. The argument is that it should go to those older workers as well. That was the only measure where the public more people said they thought the government should do more. So in that one area, the people are actually asking for more to be spent. But, of course, back to those old days of debt and deficit, when you compare the budget reaction today to last week's budget with Peter Costello's first budget. Peter Costello's budget was his most successful budget by polling, and yet it was the budget where most people said they would be personally worse off, but they thought that the economy would be better off. Now, in this budget, what we've seen is such a huge spend that, of course, most people or more people think they'll see themselves better off. But really, the underlying problem for Labor here is that Labor supporters, a large chunk of Labor supporters, are actually approving of the Josh Frydenberg budget. They're approving of Scott Morrison's leadership, and they're refusing to endorse Anthony Albanese's road out to recovery. This is very important for Labor.
Yeah, I was just going to just say there, you know, he's very cannily gone after the ground, even on the Labor right, you know, edging off the centre, where Labor supporters, you call them blue collar, you call them sort of what I'd call old-fashioned Labor voters, feel abandoned. He's gone after sort of middle Australia, lower income families. He's gone after people with fundamentally decent values who feel if you work hard, you want to get ahead. So, and I think that's his background and that's his own story. I mean, his dad was a policeman and all of those sorts of things we know about Scott Morrison. You've written in the Australian today, though, that Anthony Albanese, it's too early to say if he's you know, broken away from last year's election loss and all the policies, but the internal numbers of this latest news poll suggest he hasn't made any ground, and so far he is slipping behind. You know, is it him or his policies, Dennis, or a combination of both?
I think it's a combination of both, Peter. It is clear that Labor is still carrying the burden, that losing legacy of Bill Shorten, of the big spending, big taxing agenda with huge climate change targets which were uncosted and which the Australian Republic rejected at the last election. But since then, it's also shown that the people are not coming back to Labor. Scott Morrison is very cleverly appealing to manufacturers, people in the regions, miners, and all the tax cuts were for low to middle-income earners. So what Scott Morrison is doing is marginalising Anthony Albanese, and Anthony Albanese's budget reply was a $6 billion extra for childcare, with subsidies for families up to $530,000 a year, now earning $530,000 a year. There is very little room for Anthony Albanese to go in reaction to the budget. I think the only way Labor can break this nexus of being caught between the pragmatism of Scott Morrison and the legacy of Bill Shorten is to actually create some bold new policies which appeal to those lost voters who are just not returning to Labor, clearly in the news poll, and they are crucially picking Scott Morrison to lead them out of the recession, lead them into recovery, and that's at the next budget and then the next election, which everyone assumes is going to be in the last half of next year. There's not much time for Labor. They're still a long way behind. They're not picking up, and Scott Morrison is marginalising them.
Yeah, and they haven't done the policy work yet, and they haven't got their national platform to, bring all the various factions together, at least in some sort of, lay down your weapons détente to shut up until they get through the election next year. Fascinating analysis as always, Dennis. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Peter.